Hello and welcome back to Cloud with Chris. You're with me, Chris Reddington, and we'll be talking about all things cloud. Now, the backlog of episodes continues to look healthy, with a number of additional session ideas planned and a number of guests scheduled to come in. But please do keep your thoughts coming in, and if you find these podcasts useful, please do continue to share, and I hope that we can grow the community that supports it. Let's introduce the next episode. We have another guest. We're starting to bring a few of those previous topics together in this episode. We touch upon requirements, DevOps, and building applications, or rather APIs, in the cloud. So in this episode, I talk with a colleague and a friend, Peter Piper, on factors that relate and impact API design. So without further ado, here we go. Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Cloud with Chris. Now, in this episode, we're going to be evolving the conversation that we've been having over recent episodes. When you think about architectures, we think about the evolution of some of those architectures that we see. You may think of N-tier architectures, you may think of things like microservices. And when you think about those microservice style architectures, or pretty much any architecture, one of the things that we think more and more about these days as a common thought is our APIs and how we provide access to some of our data and some of the different resources that might be valuable to our users. Those users might be internal, those users might be external, but there's a lot of gravity in those APIs, and that's something that we hear as a trend really within the industry these days. So I'm very, very pleased to say that I'm joined today by a colleague and a friend in architecture, Mr. Peter Piper. Peter, how are you doing, sir?
Hi, Chris. I'm doing well. How about yourself?
All good, thank you, sir. All good, all good. Now, Peter, I know that this topic is something which is a bit of a passion area for you. I know that you've done some discussions and conversations about this in some local user groups that you are involved with as well. So maybe let's start at the beginning and frame the discussion. So when you think about APIs and API design, why is this relevant in today's world?
APIs have been used across many different paradigms within our technology, and more importantly, the trend and the mindset around API is to have intercommunications between various either subsystems or third-party solutions, and they could be transported on a web-based protocol such as HTTP or internal. So well-architected APIs allow high cohesion and low coupling, so that way they could be malleable, they could evolve, they could be versioned. So the trend and the design has been around for in the 50s since systems have started that I've seen. And more importantly, it allows you to continue and evolve your product and your solution and still be able to integrate with others.
Gotcha. So there's a couple of themes in there then that you were saying. It's the integration maybe with other services, whether they are internal and first party or whether they are third party, but also really providing extra value to your end users and giving them a way of interfacing into your own system so that they can maybe rely on your services pragmatically as well. So, it's both about providing value to the end users themselves, but also being able to integrate into other systems.
Exactly. And more importantly, not everybody's going to be a subject matter expert with respect
Mm.
to the domain that the API does provide in terms of data, services, etc. So not having to have that business acumen and that around the domain allows people to build APIs that can be consumed by many parties.
So providing that easy entry point, you're there to provide the service and you abstract away a load of that complexity so that your end users can focus on the thing that they want to focus on. And you deliver the value of that insight and that data or whatever that API is providing. So then if we think about maybe delving into that API design thought a little bit more, I know something as well that you're very interested in is requirements. So how can maybe requirements drive some of that API design? Are there certain factors, certain design decisions or design points that you commonly see affecting how you might shape or frame what your APIs might look like in an organization, for example?
Sure. Yeah, with respect to requirements, they're not going to be fully baked in our today frame of application development, and that is being agile. So the requirements as they come through time and things get exposed, having your API operations, your contracts, your inner business processes will have to become more versioned or more malleable to support the evolution and change of the API, especially as time progresses. So many APIs that we see in our current technology landscape have been around for 10, 15, maybe 20 years, but they've evolved over time. And so, to the point of having cohesion and low coupling, allows you to provide your services and not affect your users until they are ready to upgrade to the latest version of your particular API. So, with respect to requirements, supporting a versioning model is critical. So that way things are not broken. And versioning could be either a major or a minor. It doesn't matter as long as you communicate that to your consumers, your internal users, your internal development team, so that way they could provide that framework within the API as it gets built. That's the biggest
Mm.
requirement. The other is understanding data contracts and how they evolve over time. So, in other words, data schemas that you're abstracting to your consumers. Um, that is the biggest pain point that I've seen over time. And then the protocol. Typically, it's HTTP, but if it's SOAP based or REST based, that is a thing that has evolved. I still see SOAP based APIs, but with technologies that are available now, you can transform the request from REST to SOAP and SOAP back to REST. So understanding how you could repurpose and continue to use your legacy or your older APIs in the current landscape is
Mm.
another thing.
There's so many great things that you just said in there, Peter. I mean, you mentioned about the concept of versioning and this idea of our consumers depending on the different versions. And I think to be clear, when we talk about this, when we say consumer, lots of people might be thinking external party calling in to some API. Maybe there's some rate limiting, but we don't even just mean those users. We mean it could be one microservice depending on another microservice, and that's where that whole contract idea comes into play, right? Where you have this decoupling between the different APIs, but there's this cohesion, this ability to be able to somewhat depend on each other but not directly. If something goes wrong, that then everything goes wrong on the dependent system. So um, I really love that idea there. And actually, I think you've managed to plant my next segue into my next question here, which is around legacy applications. And you said at the end there that you can almost convert some of these REST API calls into things like SOAP calls. And I guess there's maybe some kind of pattern that you might be thinking about there. And I don't want to second guess that, but I'm curious, how can we breathe new life into some of those APIs, those legacy ones, and bring them into a modern architecture? Because I guess that's one of the great things about the cloud. You don't necessarily have to just directly lift and shift. You don't just have to re-architect. You could do a blend of both. So what options maybe do people have when they think about maybe reinvigorating some of those legacy APIs, for example?
Sure, sure. So the biggest thing is understanding who your consumers are. So that way you could understand impact. And not only that, that will allow you to continue to drive that adoption and still continue to have that value first and foremost within the consumer of that particular API, whether the consumer being, to your point, internal or external. So that's the first thing is just understanding who's doing what with whatever information for whatever entry point that you are providing. That's the biggest perspective. And that will then drive a little bit more of how do you evolve to this new paradigm that is much more REST based versus the SOAP based services. Um, and so to that point, there are different patterns that they don't necessarily have to be within a particular specific technology, whether that be a MuleSoft or a Apogee or Azure API management type of product, but there are patterns to support that transformation to provide that level of abstraction because ultimately your API is having that level of abstraction to your ultimate data set. I've seen instances where the data schema is just a one-to-one all the way up to your data contracts, and that's not quite ideal, but nevertheless, understanding not just the pattern of, especially with microservices, that is the bounded context, understanding the limited domain in which your data contract is going to provide. And so that way you could have quick, rapid release cycles. Typically, in those SOAP based legacy services, they're much more monolithic. Think of a master data management type system. And more importantly, the level of consumers becomes much more broad in terms of the enterprise consumption. So, understanding not just the pattern that you've established that allowed you to have that market, not market penetration per se, but just in terms of adoption and consumers. But as you continue to evolve, you could continue to have the monolithic in a REST-based model, and then start doing what they call a strangler type pattern to start performing this decomposition into a microservices model. So that way you could have a blend between microservices and much more of a monolithic.
Hmm. What you're alluding to there is also the idea of having this facade, right? This piece right in front of our APIs that maybe abstracts away some of that complexity, abstracts away some of those underlying details that we need to be aware of the API. Because then what we can do is we can decouple this idea of having that direct dependency on a specific API version or having a dependency on certain things that we need to go and call in. We might, for example, at one point want to move from one version of an API to another, and we need a way of being able to switch across from that one version of an API to another. We might, for example, want to go ahead and mock or stub out what responses might look like, just so we can go ahead and let any of those development teams start playing with what that API might look like. And I guess that's really what we're talking about, isn't it? Having that almost translation layer in between whatever the client is and that end API call.
Correct. Yeah. And to your point, yes, those particular design patterns are highly front end visible, but there are other ones, for example, backends for front ends. And so if you are developing APIs for particular platforms, such as a mobile device, you have to design your API in a slightly different fashion, especially when you're dealing with a SOAP based, if you want to continue having that legacy and not having to rewrite it, then you could have this particular API management component, whether or not that is in the Azure platform or any other cloud platform, to support that particular consumer, whether it be a tablet device or a phone device or a computer.
Gotcha, understood. And I must say, all of this talk of soap is bringing back some memories of one of my first experiences of API design. Actually, a good number of years ago, where I was part of just a team for an online game, a sci-fi game, and I remember it clearly. One of the first tasks that I had when I joined this team was building. At the time, this new thing called SOAP, and we were building some APIs because there were no APIs that people could call into to access the game. Because then one of the ideas this team wanted was to expose some of the core game functionality to those gamers. Because then what they could do is they could build on, their third-party marketplaces or their different kind of clan or faction websites and all these things, and make that whole game experience a bit richer. So this talk of being able to bring new life to some of those older legacy APIs is bringing a warm feeling and some good nostalgia there as well. Maybe let's think about some more modern APIs. Let's move away a little bit from the legacy side. So if we think maybe we're part of a development team, we're working on a brand new project, for example, I know there's going to be certain technologies that might favor themselves to this, but I'm curious on some of your thoughts. If we wanted to get going quickly, what are some of the things that maybe we would think about from an API management or an API design or implementation side of things? Are there maybe certain technologies that we could go after and start thinking about? I know in the Azure space, for example, if we wanted to very quickly prototype something out in this space, Logic apps could be a good contender there, for example. So I'm just curious of your thoughts. Are there certain trends, certain themes that you see, and certain patterns that come up of, we want to experiment and try something out really quickly. Let's start using these particular tools, for example.
Sure, yeah. It depends on your SDK, but there are particular packages like, for example, GenFu, and that will start mocking out lorem ipsum type data into your data contracts. So you could have, you don't have to have a backend database, but you could have a data contract that your operation will provide. So effectively, it speaks to this mocking capability. So if you do not have that kind of an SDK available, there are Azure Functions, Logic Apps, etc. To your point, that will allow that mocking to be easily constructed. And then if we go into a much more robust model using Azure API management, you can mock the data contracts or effectively the response quickly within not just the portal, but through infrastructure as code, through ARM templates, etc. And you could do it for a particular HTTP status code. So for example, if you are going to be creating several APIs that align to a CRUD, which is a create, read, update, and delete typical pattern that we find in APIs. So for a read operation, it could be respond with a 200 or a 404. 200 could be, "Oh, everything's okay, here's the data, here's the record." They call it a URI or a resource. Either way, you could provide statuses, messages, your data contract for exceptions, and then you could start building out proof of concepts very quickly. And for example, in API management, I don't even have to have a backend app service or compute of any kind. So it all depends on, to your point, our requirements saying, okay, we want to quickly prototype something. Yes. What do we want to prototype? And then you could do kind of a swag at it. But ultimately, it's the level of communication between the producer and the consumer of the API to validate either the business requirement or just an operation of education.
One of the things that struck me in what you said there as well is there may be different personas at play there as well. I know we've talked about the idea of these either internal users or external users who might be accessing an API. But if we think about the people managing that, this of course depends on the size of our team and what kind of organization we're working in. But there may be people, for example, who are managing the front end who need access to that facade layer, for example. There may be someone working on the facade layer and there may be someone working on the back end. And those may all be different responsibilities. They may be some kind of shared responsibility. Again, it depends on the team. But really, what you start doing is getting a little bit into this DevOps mindset, don't you, of decoupling these different components and being able to start bringing some of that agility, I guess. And like you rightly said a little earlier on in the discussion here, starting to decouple some of those components, and then what you get, think of those broader requirements, not just the API side now, is if one of those APIs has a bit of a wobble, something happens, something goes wrong with the underlying infrastructure for one of those APIs, because again, in a microservice world, there's nothing there saying, for example, that we have to host everything on the same type of infrastructure or the same code base or the same languages or whatnot. It could all be very different. So, what might affect one part of the system shouldn't affect then the rest of the system if we've designed it in in an appropriate way where the microservices have some kind of graceful degradation. So I'm curious that maybe let's explore a little bit more on the DevOps side of the house here. When we think about DevOps, I think one of the emerging trends is this concept of DevSecOps and being able to bring in some of those security processes, some of those security pieces that you might want to think about from the system. When we think about APIs, one of the things that we might think about, for example, is whether we need to authenticate to an API, for example, whether we have the right token and credentials and whatnot to go and make that API call. What are your thoughts on things like that and how we could potentially bring them into some kind of automation of the deployment of our APIs and pipelines, for example?
Sure. No, this is a very good topic. The DevSecOps terminology has been used, but the understanding of where security is going to be introduced, whether there are terms such as shift left and shift right with respect to where security is within DevOps. So if we think of a visual infinity symbol, Dev is on one side, which is typically on the left, and then the ops is on the right. And security is, if you think about it, it's in the middle. And so, are your developers going to integrate security into their application design? Or is operations going to have security as part of the infrastructure or resources that are providing your API? So it could be a combination of the two. To your point, the various technologies within Azure, such as Azure API management, you could introduce policies at the entire API level or in the individual operations to do token validations, JWT tokens, which is JSON Web Tokens. Or you could do OAuth 2 or OpenIDC, which is OpenID Connect type of operations. But more importantly, you need to embed that level of token and validation within the operations that you are constructing in your API that will ultimately be published. The other aspect of this API and DevSecOps is understanding what these design patterns, such as gatekeeper, bulkhead, which is one of the things that you mentioned, is how do you isolate and ensure resiliency and not dependency and one rogue operation taking the entire platform down. Ensuring that those type of patterns will ultimately define your success, but you don't have to build them into your design right away in terms of a requirement, but understanding which design patterns are going to be very beneficial upfront, such as, for example, if you are a consumer of an API, do you implement a circuit breaker and retry pattern? For example, in Azure API management, there is a policy for throttling. So if you invoke the API too many times based upon your subscription limit within an interval, it will then return the appropriate HTTP status code, and you cannot re-invoke the request until the throttle has been removed. So how do you incorporate that into your API design?
Awesome. So when we think about extending that DevSecOps piece a little bit further, maybe on the functional side, I guess we've talked about the implementation detail from the API side of the house, the APIs, the API management, or the facade layer. There's also things that we can do from a testing perspective, and I'm a huge advocate of some of this area here now. But being able to bring that testing mindset into the pipelines that we talk about, lots of people think about unit testing, integration testing. Some think about load testing, maybe, which is very, very important and maybe not a topic for today. But security is also something that you can start testing for, right? Like when we think about a little bit earlier, the idea of those JWT pieces or the OAuth or OIDC and the authentication to those and the authorization that we have the right credentials or whatnot. And I am really who I say I am, and I can access this API. We can test for some of that as part of the pipeline. We can make that some kind of automated operation and validate, if we try and call that API, what happens if we don't pass in any credentials? I'm curious, when you see working with different end organizations, for example, are there certain practices like this that you see them doing? Are there common pitfalls, for example, whether that's a DevOps piece in particular or whether that's just designing their APIs in general, for example? Are there certain good things and maybe challenges that you see them running into, let's say?
Yeah, that's a very good question. With respect to testing and API, it becomes a little bit more of a challenge on top of that. And that is if you are moving quickly and you have many developers as part of it, you may step on each other. So with respect to the security question, that's one aspect that you could definitely create and you could definitely automate from a testing framework perspective. But taking a step back and saying, okay, what is that we're doing and what is the either if you're following a minimal viable product model or if you're doing a full regression testing, to your point you have PNL, performance and load testing, but how do you incorporate your security into each of those? So for example, if you are going to be changing from one identity provider to a different identity provider, how do you validate that through your testing process? and who will be impacted as you go through that into your SDLC pipeline, ultimately to go to your production. So understanding your gate and your level of testing metric to say, I am comfortable with this based upon the requirements. Understanding the threat actor along the testing is a very big challenge. I haven't seen a good mature model in my current customer base to support that just yet, because the requirements around identity become a little bit more of a challenge as you go from one identity provider to another. The bearer tokens and the refresh tokens, that becomes another challenge with respect to testing because of the way they are built with respect to time.
Understood. Now, if we move away from the DevOps side of things, would you say from a pure API standpoint, there are certain common practices that you see different organizations taking on board, or maybe some common pitfalls that you see them running into as well there, for example?
Sure, that is one area where using an external config store, and that is, for example, Azure Key Vault, Azure App Configuration, to support the sensitive credentials to access your data stores, access other APIs, for example. That is one area where the maturity is starting to gain momentum, and which is a positive thing. However, understanding that you will need to integrate a key rotation strategy, for example, that is a big challenge. Not everybody's ready from an operating model, especially at the app dev level, when there is a key rotation if you are not using these type of external config stores or in microservices, a sidecar pattern. So, but I do see a positive trend that those key areas are definitely pain points. And I do see customers starting to introduce those concepts and address those challenges.
Understood. Well, I think we've certainly done a whistle stop tour of APIs there when we think, and maybe not just APIs, but I think a lot of common concepts. So things like microservices, things like API design, and talking through things like SOAP and REST, how we potentially bring some of those legacy APIs into the modern architecture, how we can potentially accelerate some of those POCs, and then talking a little bit about DevOps and around requirements as well, and some of those common practices and common pitfalls there. So plenty and plenty for folks to digest here. Before we wrap up, do you have any closing thoughts, any closing words of wisdom, or anything you'd maybe want to echo that we've already talked about already? If there's maybe one thing that people should take away about that journey where they go and design their APIs and go along that path.
Yes, the biggest thing that I've seen since I've developed APIs using the old ASMX model in .NET, and that is they don't implement a version out of the gate. And whether that be at the operation or at the data contract. And then try to introduce a version after becomes very painful. Not using an interface approach, that becomes another pain point, which ultimately it does allow a versioning model. And then more importantly, providing a communication to your consumers for impact. What should they be impacted by, a major change or a minor change? And then not realizing the amount of APIs each consumer is requesting. So if you are providing APIs that they have to pay for via a subscription, do you create a throttle? Do you say, I have different subscription limits and different pay tiers? And so then I have to understand who's my major consumer to help me either support a newer version to improve the feature set or the capability of my API. So ultimately, it is things evolve. You don't have to think about all of these concepts up front. But from my perspective, incorporate a versioning model up front and just call it V1, and then start to iterate over it.
Lovely thoughts there. Now, I think there's plenty of information for people to digest here, and I'm sure we could keep on talking. I'm sure there's plenty more that we could talk about on the pattern side as well. So maybe we'll have to dive into some of those patterns and some of those thoughts a little deeper another time. But Peter, thank you so much for joining today. Like I say, plenty of pearls of wisdom and knowledge shared there today. So a big thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Chris, and I enjoyed it.
There we go. Lots to take in there, thinking of different patterns and common approaches or pitfalls that have been encountered along the way in Peter's experience. Peter and I both continued chatting after we recorded the episode and had so many ideas on where we could have expanded further, so we're sure that there will be a follow-up at some point in the future. On that point, if there's anything you'd like us to expand on, please do get in touch, either on Twitter or Facebook at Cloud with Chris. And don't forget, Cloud with Chris is on your favourite platforms: Spotify, iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, Pocket Casts, YouTube, and directly at www.cloudwithchris.com. If you're enjoying the episodes that we're producing, please give a like or subscribe on your usual platform so that you can keep up to date and support the work that we're doing. Feedback is always appreciated, along with your topic suggestions. And if you think you have a topic that you would be interested in talking to me about, why not join me? Thank you for tuning in to this episode. And until next time, goodbye.